We're delighted that you're joining us today on our webinar titled Principles to Practice Implementing Your Regulatory Program. And the background for this conversation largely started from just hearing the number of our clients and our prospects who were saying, look, we've updated our policies and procedures. We keep updating and training our staff, our advisor workplace. However, we're still being challenged during exams around the how. How do we actually show and illustrate best interest principles? And for this, we brought the conversation together today. A few quick housekeeping matters before we jump in. We are recording today's conversation and plan to share it with you following today's session. This webinar qualifies for one IACCP CE credit, which is a mouthful. For folks who are attending, they can confirm their attendance by contacting the IACCP Resource Center following today's conversation. As always, please feel free to engage in the dialogue. You can use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to insert any questions you'd like for our audience, as you are seeing here today. And with that said, let's jump into the thick of things with a quick introduction from our panelists. Jennifer, do you mind kicking us off?
No, absolutely. Thank you. Definitely appreciate being here today. My name is Jennifer Salyers. I'm currently serving as a director and senior consultant with Renaissance Regulatory Services, also a mouthful. We shorten it to RRS. We're a boutique consulting firm primarily focused on US-based broker-dealers and investment advisors. I've served primarily the bulk of my career, though, as in-house CCO, for a variety of different firms, from private funds to large public asset managers down to the retail space. So excited to engage in this conversation today.
Thank you, Jennifer. Always welcome to join us. Mr. Bryce Carter.
Yeah, Parham, thanks for having me. Excited to have this conversation with these stellar folks. I'm Bryce Carter with F2 Strategy, also a boutique consulting firm, but we're focused primarily on technology and marketing and supporting our crisp and clean advisor client experience. I am head of solutions, which just means focus on our research, and I focus on expanding our capabilities to better serve our clients.
Thank you, Bryce, and welcome. Mr. Sarlanis.
Hi, everyone. Parham, thanks for having me on again. My name is George Sarlanis. I'm the head of supervision at Snowden Lane Partners. We are hybrid broker-dealer and RIA. Been in the industry for about 18 years, 17 of them in supervision. So coming from bigger to smaller, and happy to be here. So looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Thank you, George, and welcome. Mr. Wagner.
Well, thanks, Parham, and hi, everyone. I'm Ed Wegner, and I am the head of the governance, risk, and compliance practice at Oyster Consulting. At Oyster, we provide business, compliance, and technology solutions to firms in the financial services industry, primarily to broker-dealers, investment advisors, investment funds. Prior to joining Oyster, I joined Oyster in July of 2020. Prior to joining them, I was with FINRA for most of my career, where I worked out of the Chicago district office. And when I left FINRA, I was the head of the Midwest region, responsible for the exam and surveillance programs in the Chicago and Kansas City district offices.
Thank you, Ed. And as always, thank you for joining us. So, folks, as you can see, we have a very stellar number of panelists here for you to speak about from every different angle, from regulatory compliance to from a practitioner's perspective, as well from a technologist's view. For folks who haven't met me, my name is Parham, and I'll be your host for today's conversation. And for those who haven't come across InvestorCom, we are a leading regulatory compliance software provider for wealth and asset managers across North America. And our award-winning solutions are known for their intuitive design and ability to eliminate compliance risk, as well as foster growth for our clients. With that tagline out of the way, what are we going to cover off today? So we're going to first touch on the how component of our conversation, but much more so from the perspective of how do you do that? How do you implement programs when there is so much change in the air? Given the new administration, we'll dive into that topic to start, and then we'll talk about regulatory changes and what specific trends you can look out for given the exam priorities that have been published by the SEC and more recently the oversight report by FINRA, like that new name. And then finally, we'll talk about responding to the current environment and get into the nuts and bolts of the how component of today's conversation. Without further ado, let's jump in. As always, please engage and ask us any questions that may come up throughout today's conversation. So let's jump in, and who wants to go first? I'm kidding. Jennifer, let's start with an environmental scan of all of the activity expected or not expected from Washington. What are the key regulatory challenges you're hearing and you're monitoring across your client base?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And I'll tell you, I was in DC last week. I had the opportunity in a small forum to listen to Commissioner Peirce speak. And I'll just say that, there's a lot of political uncertainty right now. When you're in DC, like you can cut it with a knife. Federal employees have all sorts of options in front of them, right? There's all this regulatory unknown. Even the commissioner spoke about, she has thoughts about her staff, right? So there's just a lot going on. And I think that kind of, tends to bleed its way through down into the operations and the day-to-day practices, especially in the financial services space. Let's just kind of start at a high level, right? We're working under an interim commissioner, Commissioner Ueda, of the chair here, right? I think there's this thought, Trump has nominated or he's picked Paul Adkins, but there's no confirmation hearing date yet, right? So that's still kind of in limbo. As far as Adkins goes, he's kind of a known for the industry. He served as commissioner from 2002 to 2008. He definitely is pro-industry, I would say, as opposed to maybe maybe even two former commissioners. We've definitely seen some movement in the crypto-friendly territory, right? Commissioner Peirce is going to lead this crypto task force. I get the sense that if Adkins is confirmed, right, we're going to see just a dial back, right? Probably less enforcement actions, probably less whistleblower matters. I think we'll see a shift from some of the larger, more contentious rules, right? Think custody, think service provider proposed rules. ESG disclosures. I saw there was some commissioner statements on some of that activity today, even. And so I think, but I do think that there will be a focus on definitely the digital asset space. I also think that there'll be more guidance and risk alerts issued once some of this political unrest kind of settles out and the commission can kind of get back to quote business as usual.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's fantastic insight. And a little bit of a reprieve and some calm would be great. And speaking of which, Ed, you're plugged in on I'll say on the various regulatory organizations. And what do you expect to see in the first 6 months, perhaps, of the new administration?
Yeah, I think, as Jennifer had mentioned, that the regulatory environment is always a real important consideration, as you're kind of looking forward and seeing, how you're going to adapt your programs. And, and that's in any environment, right? And so when you're thinking about all the uncertainty that Jennifer had mentioned, that's even more pronounced. And so you kind of look and try to read the tea leaves. I don't know, the next 6 months, I'm not really sure. There's a lot going on in Washington, how that's going to impact the commission, how that's going to impact the self-regulatory organizations, we have yet to see. But clearly, there's going to be a significant difference between, the programs of Gary Gensler, which was really aggressive enforcement and rulemaking, to what we're going to see under the new administration. And I would anticipate Atkins is going to get confirmed. He's a known quantity, and I think one of the questions was, with all the changes and the things going on in DC, what type of person they would bring in to run the SEC. And Atkins is a known quantity. He's been a commissioner in the past. He seems to be somebody that sees the value of the commission, but definitely has a different focus than Gensler did. So like Jennifer said, I would definitely expect to see less of a focus on enforcement actions, more focus on the exam program to identify and encourage, compliance programs, identifying best practices, like Jennifer said, using the information that they learned through the exam program to help issue guidance and alerts. And in terms of enforcement, looking back at Adkins, past, he definitely appears to be somebody who's an advocate for the enforcement program, but definitely looks to use the enforcement program differently than you would seen under Gensler, moving less from a way to sort of focus on rulemaking by enforcement and driving rules home through the enforcement program, focusing more on potential harm to retail investors, things like Reg BI, those types of things. So you're going to see less of a focus on things like enforcement actions around procedures or controls or books and records, and more substantive areas where you could see potential harm, especially focused on retail investors. Another thing that, in terms of policy making and rule making, I think like under Jay Clayton, you can expect to see more of a focus on fostering capital formation and innovation in terms of the rulemaking. So, expect to see that type of focus. But in addition to, the regulatory environment, when we talk about Washington and the regulators, I would definitely focus on what's happening in the courts. We've already seen legal challenges to some pretty significant rules. And a big example, we've talked about this in past panels, is the DOL's PTE 2020-02. And the courts seem to be very open to hearing these types of challenges. And, one challenge, you talked about regulatory uncertainty, it really makes it difficult for compliance departments to really kind of focus and plan on how they're going to implement rules when there's so much uncertainty. So that's another area that I would be focused on, is as you look to implement new rules, what is the likelihood that those rules will be challenged? What is the likelihood that the courts will be receptive to those challenges? And what does that mean in terms of how you go about implementing your compliance programs around those rules?
Thank you, Ed. That's fantastic. I'm just curious, Bryce, what do you think on the technology side, given this sort of current state of affairs? How are your clients making strategic technology decisions as they look forward to their future and their success?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And kind of pointing back to something that Ed said, the importance kind of starts with the basics first, where a firm has clearly articulated and documented out their process, procedures, and controls. They know exactly on the page what they do today to back up their compliance program. What I'm seeing is change is always a constant, right? With a new administration now and then one in the future, there's going to be ups and downs and ebbs and flows. But clearly articulated within their tech stack is the need to understand the nuts and bolts of their process, procedures, and controls. What I see as always, like a firm as they grow along from budding nascent player into an enterprise level firm, is the need to enable technology that's crisp and clear, moving away from paper documentation and whatnot, but something that supports the process to make the advisors effective at what they're doing and as quickly as possible, but aligned with their compliance needs.
Love that. Love that. Before I go to you, George, I'd love to have our audience engaged on our first polling question. What do you all think? What's going to be the most significantly impacted or affected regulation under the new administration? So far, everyone's tracking. Jennifer, your predictions. I'll pop this up in maybe 15 more seconds.
I don't see an all of the above in there, so.
There is an other, but nobody's selected that, but I may have just skewed the results. Okay, got pretty good responses so far, 62. Let's end the poll and show the results. Poll, share the results. So, ding, 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 Jennifer.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's hard to ignore. Now, whether this is just, look over here while we do this over here is yet to be determined, right? We've seen regulators do that before, but listen, the SEC kind of keeps peddling this crypto in the background despite all the political kind of uncertainty, right? Like the SEC just withdrew some staff accounting bulletin maybe like a week or two ago. It was really subtle, but it did change how firms, especially those that are custodying digital and crypto assets, can account for them. And both SIPFA and the ABA came out and were like, yes, and congratulated the SEC. We're very supportive of that withdrawal of that action. And so behind the scenes, it still feels like there's some like pro work being done, right? Like even though it may be small movements, it definitely seems like it's on the pro front for how the SEC is going to look at crypto going forward. And if you'll recall, ABA was one of the largest opponents of the custodial rule, right? That new IA custody rule. And so it's very interesting to see them come out and be supportive of this latest withdrawal action from the SEC. So definitely something to stay tuned into, especially if you're in that marketplace, but also interesting as it unfolds.
Just to follow up on that, I think, clearly digital assets is going to be an area of focus, for the new administration, for the SEC, defining what that regulatory framework is going to look like for digital assets. But just because, that looks like the poll, I think, tracks with what we've all seen, I wouldn't discount those other areas because I think all of those are likely subject to, a potential relook by the commission, but also, as I mentioned earlier, also the potential for court challenges of not only new rules as they come out, but existing rules can be challenged as well. So definitely keep an eye on that.
Yeah, just to echo that, Ed, Atkins is known for really being a proponent for that retail investor, right? Which is Reg BI hinges on that. And so if you think about a commission made up of Adkins and Ueda and Pierce, right, who all kind of serve together formally, right, and who all have been focused on that retail investor versus your institutional or private fund investors, I definitely see that as a close second.
Awesome. This is super insightful. Let's turn it to George. George, you are actually in the firm's seat and you're helping maneuver the ship forward. What are you seeing? What's causing you to not sleep at night? Any insights there?
Yeah, thanks, Parham. Good question. Fortunately, sleep is still good for now. The uncertainty is kind of where I enjoy navigating. So I think, everybody before me has made it very clear. There was a few moments where I kind of wanted to chime in real fast, but a little bit about what Bryce was saying. And I think what makes it easier or to get a little bit of sleep is the technology in place is instrumental when you're developing these procedures. And why I say that is because all of the things that we've added or adjusted were easy technology shifts for us, right? So the ability to make an addition when the technology is already in place, it's much easier than some other competitors that I know are working on the paper aspect or, filling out like PDFs and things of the nature. And even just before this, I was scrolling around and looking at the SC priority list, and I was looking at the whole concept of, account structures, right? Just something simple. And these types of technologies, they're out there, right? And if we have to make quick shifts about, regulatory changes based on like what Jennifer said and Ed said, if there's some newer policy that comes out there, that's the technology that we leverage to be able to use for us going forward, right? So if my hardest position during change is updating my procedures, I think I'm in a good place. I think the idea of having to quickly scramble to get technology to make things more efficient is going to be a big struggle. Parham and I, we've talked about this before, right? A lot of what we do, and I got to meet Bryce as well, as relying heavily on automation and low headcount. And a lot of times when we've had our reviews, it was, how do you get all of this done? And the simple answer we had during our regulatory exam was technology. We don't rely on paper pushing and things of that nature. We really understood that the leverage we have on technology, while it could be a quick and change or difficult shift in the beginning, down the road is where I feel comfortable now coming into this new administration that if there's any changes, I don't feel that it's going to be a big project for our firm. And I think that's been kind of how we've been navigating. So we're like everybody else, we're at the edge of our seats, just kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. We've prepared for digital assets. We've prepared for our account structures. We've prepared for PTE and where we are. We use the technologies available through InvestorCom and others. And, for us, we're at that point of plugging and playing. So I think one of the great parts about, being in this industry now and coming from, I remember my first day was a paper annuity, right, application. I think it was a check and an app, and it was one page, and you taped it to the back and you sent it into the home office, right? And kind of going through that 18-year shift, you really start to appreciate the leverage you can get with technology. And I think that was part of the role that I enjoyed the most on the how, was really drilling it home. And I think one of the biggest successes that I've had was staying ahead of the curve. I don't believe we're a very reaction type firm. We are very proactive. And my job, even when we were dealing with PTE, was just scheduling the trainings with those, right? Staying on top of everybody so that they understand that the platforms and the technology that we build and roll out, it is there to supplement and help their book of business. It is there to help them protect their clients and meet the needs that we need to do as a firm, as advisors, and making sure that we're always working in everybody's best interest. So I think a lot of it is when you come in from the practitioner's perspective, which I have that special part of this call, was really just reminding the teams and our firm to just constantly do our follow-ups, right? We're not going to react to certain things. We're going to constantly push trainings and constantly remind about the technologies that are there, because we use it for you to protect yourself, protect the firm, and to, understand the rules and regulations and why we have these things in place. And I think that part of that concept starts to hit, right, as you continue to do something over and over again. Change is hard for a lot of people, and I think I can speak for everybody, right? Our firm is anywhere from newer advisors to people that have been in the industry for 40, 50 years and are just used to a certain way, right? So how you present that, and the one thing that I've always focused on is making the technology sufficient and compliant that we can use, but keeping it simple, right? So that the hardest part on the tech space for me, and Bryce might disagree or agree, but if you can't use it, they won't use it, right? So if they find complexities in it, it's just, they won't use it. And that's just, part of our habits as people, right? How many times you go through an application, like, yeah, okay, I'll just go to this later. I didn't realize it was 20 pages long. So the ease of convenience and understanding where you can build out what's going to meet your rules and follow your procedures is imperative to how you continue to move forward. So sorry, that was a little long-winded, but the technology part is something that we leverage and appreciate a lot at our firm. So hopefully, others can take that into consideration and constantly be proactive and use the technology that's out there to benefit you and your business.
Bryce.
Yeah, I was going to say no disagreement there. That's certainly 100% true. Technology needs to be easy to use and understandable. Like on the journey of moving from like a paper-based process, PDF like documentation, old world, 18 years ago, like you experienced, George, into today using technology to enable that. There is a change management component that the drum must be beat every day on telling the clean message as to why you're moving to the technology, what exactly is it going to do for you, and just know that it doesn't happen overnight. So for those adopting technology, and I think we've all kind of experienced this, that it starts to click across the board at different levels for the users. So having a key champion showing the way, making sure it's crystal clear and easy to use is critical in ensuring that you have a clean change management program on that.
And can I just add, like, I know we've talked about some complex regulations, right? Like, Reg BI and PT 2020-02, but the staff came out a couple of years ago with their bulletin about standard of conduct that applied to both Reg BI and the IA fiduciary duty. And in that, they listed over 15 data points that the staff thought, in their opinion, that firms should be capturing just for the investment profile of a retail investor, right? That's not complicated, right? Like, that's not tied to a separate regulation, right? That's just, hey, we think in order to know your retail customer or client, you need to have at least these 15 data points, right? If you're doing that with paper or Excel, that's going to be complicated and difficult to manage. And not only that, it's going to be really difficult for you to use that data, which does have business value, to drive business value, right? So, I mean, the simple things that can be done to leverage technology is there too.
Well, just to follow up on your point, Jennifer, it seems as though the regulators are writing rules now almost with the assumption that technology is going to be facilitating it. And so, it's not that firms can't use manual processes to do it. It's just going to be more and more difficult. And, we're going to get into more detail in terms of using technology, implementing technology, and, how that impacts things like examinations. But it just seems like it's becoming more and more difficult to be able to do that effectively unless you have some technology solution. I think a big driver of that is just, that the regulators focus on, or expectation that firms have some type of technology support in terms of compliance.
This is so key to the how part of our conversation, right? 15 data points every single time you make a recommendation, you got to compare across different securities. It's got to be done simply. Let's go back to our audience, get a pulse here, get a poll question. There has been very many phases of best interest adoption, whether you look at it from the broker-dealer side or the investment advisory side. Where does your firm stand in that best interest evolutionary process? There's been some tech-enabled firms. There are folks who are using manual PDFs, and then others sort of more earlier on were in that goodwill compliance phase. So I'm seeing some excellent results. I'll give it one more second. This is actually quite interesting, more interesting than I expected. So let's see if we're going to hit 50 answers before I share the poll. More reason for some background music. Here we go. We hit 50. Let me just end the poll and share the results. So 50% are still in that manual PDF form stage, which is fascinating. And I'll just speak perhaps a little bit from what we have observed in our journey with our prospects and our clients. And some of the most egregious practices are, by and large, the length and the depth of information that's being asked in a lot of those manual PDF forms. The one we saw most recently, and I think I've spoken with some of the panelists about this, where a firm with 400 reps had adopted a 7-page best interest attestation form. And just put yourself in the rep's shoes, who's making a livelihood, and every time they're making a recommendation, they now have to go through a 7-page manual form process, which is contra to just about everything everybody on our panel has been touching on. But that's just been my insight, and I thought I'd share it. Any other data insights?
Just real quickly, Parm, just a couple of things on that. I think what's interesting is looking at this, but if you saw this over time, I'm sure you would see that phase 3 is a shrinking number, whereas the tech-enabled is a growing number. And then phases 1 and 2 clearly are ones that probably started out pretty high early on, but have been shrinking. But that's just it's sort of an evolution. And one of the things, and I remember this back, being with FINRA, doing exams and looking at firms' policies and procedures in general and the processes that they had. I think sometimes there's a thought of more is always better, because the more information you're gathering, the more questions you're asking, the more documentation you're creating, the better your program's going to be. And I think, George, you had mentioned that enough is always better, not more. And you get to a point where, you lose the audience in the field and, their ability to adopt what you're trying to do when you have things like that. And then they just go and fill it in because it's something that they have to do. And then you have to worry about the quality of what they're doing. So it's just that more is always better. In compliance is definitely a thing, but it just, I don't think that it is really what you need to be focused on.
I'd love to get Bryce's take on that number 3 bucket, because one of the things that I saw when I saw that was light at the end of the tunnel, which is those number 3 folks, the manual PDF folks, you have an operationalized process, right? You know what you do, you know what your policy says, you're working on implementing it, and it's manual, right? And so I just see that as like a great space to be in to transition to tech, right?
Totally agree. Yep, totally agree. And oftentimes what I see at firms is like there's the tyranny of we only have 24 hours in the day, and what is prioritized is what is focused and worked on. So, maybe you're in this phase now, but there is a better way of doing things, perhaps supported with technology. So there is a rationalization type of approach to say, clearly articulate the problem statement. Today, we do things manually. It bogs down advisors or reps in their time to do this. Looking into building a business case of, yes, technology costs money. It's generally more free than a PDF form. But a rationalization of a business case can oftentimes point out that technology is going to provide, ROI on, yes, there's a cost component to it, but there's likely a savings of time that can be quantified and, supported in making that decision. That's what I would say is like understanding you've got this, exactly as you said, Jennifer, a process of doing things. You should be filling out this PDF, walking through it every single time. It goes off and is imaged somewhere, and put somewhere for an archive for somebody to look it up later in an audit. Well, all of that can be digitized and supported within technology and streamline an audit later down the road with a click of the button.
All of it.
George, I'm interested because you have been on this journey. Like you've experienced it too. Like, is what I'm saying true? Have you bought more time across your advisors by leaving the PDFs behind and focusing on technology?
I mean, you mentioning the archive folder brought back the nightmares. So yes, I have been in that position as well, as manual PDF forms. So I've actually thoroughly enjoyed leading the charge, working a lot with Parm and other groups on technology, because it was just a space for me that, I've always understood that, time is valuable, right? And I always think of myself as a financial advisor, right? And I think part of the success that we've had in the compliance and supervision perspective is just reminding ourselves that you got to put yourself in the position as an advisor who's dealing with calls, executions, clients, things of that nature all day, right? And I know I'm not speaking just for myself, but the feedback you get all the time is we're boggled down with paperwork. We're boggled down with compliance. Well, you're not, right? The boggle work of the paper is on you, right? So if you can't push through that PDF manual side to get into that technology space, you're doing yourself the disservice, right? So, and I get it. It is very difficult. Again, I think it's all change management, right? It's about, and I think the idea of being flexible is imperative to a successful business. It brings up opportunities. I can't tell you in this transition, in just a year, those that were very driven on the manual side that started to use the technology actually opened themselves up to more opportunity on areas that they weren't even aware were available, right? So if you're, and I agree with you, right? So you get that manual side, you get the PDF, operation says scan, email it, place it in the 2024 archive folder, rinse, repeat, right? Now you have to make a change, right? Then you make a change to your PDF, you update your policy, then you have to get somebody on legal to sign off on that new PDF. By the time you sign off on it, the new administration comes in and says, let's scratch the first page and work from, and it's just, it's hard. It's very difficult. How do you manage all that? It's so much time. And I think that's the part that everybody excels from. And I think Ed, I brought it up too as well, where, I was talking about just the aspect of being able to be, flexible and understanding that the more time you have to want to be compliant makes it easier, right? If you're going to just fill out, forms that are 7 pages long just to get it done, then you have to worry about when you submit these, well, what's on these things, right? And it's like, it's the same rep who has a lot of meetings, and now all of a sudden, nice handwriting went into, account looks good, right? So having that ability to appreciate time and leverage that technology, I think not only allows for an easier transition in that PDF form, but it's actually more productive and more beneficial for you as well.
Well, George, and one thing you said earlier kind of struck me as we talk about this, and that's that you're getting good sleep, which is great. That's fantastic. It's good for you. But I see technology as kind of the ambient for compliance officers, because the thing when we talk to our clients, we talk to compliance officers and say, what are those things that you care about? What keeps you up at night? And they say, it's just what I don't know. And when you have a program that's based on manual forms and you're trying to implement a process, right? And you're trying to say, you train people and say, when you're doing this assessment of reasonably available alternatives, these are the things you need to consider. These are the things you need to document. Well, when you're using manual forms, how do you make sure that that's happening? How do you make sure that you're getting the quality review? And how do you monitor that over time to make sure that, what you think is happening is actually happening? And so you don't want to wait until examiners come in and ask for a bunch of forms that you've never looked at to assess your program. It's very difficult when you've got, manual forms to be able to kind of monitor across, especially if you have a distributed workforce, just how that's being implemented. Whereas if you have technology and that information's there and you can run reports and see and assess, well, how are people filling these out? You can sample by pulling stuff out of the system and take a look and see. And also, depending on how you design those programs, it can really take your policies and procedures that you have and do a good job of operationalizing them so that you can make sure that the way the information is being collected and put in there is consistent and aligned with what's in your policies and procedures, where it's much more difficult to do that if you just have a form with checkboxes that don't give you a lot of information, or free-form text that you have no control over what's going in that text. So and that's why I think you're seeing this evolution, from those forms to technology, both because the rules are complex and difficult to deal with, but it also provides you that ability to have a better comfort level that it's being implemented in the way that you had hoped.
And Ed, you bring a good point, which is before exams gets there, right? Because you know this better than anybody. Examination staff, both at FINRA and the SEC, are using data, right? Like the SEC in their examinations 2025 priorities said they're using quantitative analysts and financial engineers. I had to look up what a financial engineer even was, right? But the reality is when they show up on site, they've got data from your clearing firms, all the brokers you've been doing with, every public place you've ever filed a form, right? They have analyzed that data with experts who have master's degrees in analyzing data, right? And so to your point, they're going to ask you questions. And if you have, a stack of forms like this, where you haven't even been able to see those patterns or have those resources, I think you're right. There's an expectation as to why.
And it's not just that they're using that data, it's that they're getting so much more effective at doing that and being able to come into the office. And when they come in, they already have a sense of where your weak spots are. I remember when I was at FINRA and we were working on making the exam program more risk-based and using a lot of technology and data analysis to do it. You know, thinking back on how we used to do exams, and you guys probably remember this, a request would be made for just boxes and boxes of information, and the examiners would go through and pick samples out of there, you know. And so most of the exam was spent trying to identify what that sample was going to be. These days, with the data that they pull in before the exam, the analytics that they do, they can identify, you know, transactions already before they ever step foot into your firm of where they think, you know, potential issues are. And the problem is they have a head start over firms, you know, because unless you have you know, the technology and the ability to do that kind of analysis, you're going to be behind the eight ball. So that's another area where technology helps you as part of your monitoring to assess, well, what would I look for? How would I identify those problematic transactions and address them before FINRA comes in? But also, you know, when FINRA does come in and ask you about things, how do I make sure that I can get that information quickly so that I can take a look at it, understand the transaction that they're assessing, have a good cogent response before providing that information to them. Again, really hard to do if you have to call up a branch office and ask them for forms that they have in their files.
Jennifer and Ed stole this from me, Parham. I don't know if you saw me shake my head, but this one hit home. It brought me back, and I wanted to mention it before, but as a reminder, as we grow with technology, it's important for everybody to remember that our regulators are also growing, right? So their exams are far more intricate. And what Ed had just said, it brought me back to 17 years ago versus a recent, you know, supervisory visit that I did for one of our own, like here at my firm. And the moment I walked in, he said, how'd you know about all this stuff, right? It's all there, right? So like I actually went into a lot of these supervisory visits in our branch exams that we do already understanding their practice, right? It wasn't give me this paperwork, show me this. Where do I find all this, right? We have everything centralized. So a lot of the review is done beforehand, and you go in there, you understand their business, and you're saying, you know, why do you do all this on these systems, but you're still doing this manually? This is like not a good use of your time, right? You push this in this direction, right? So we're not only are we doing the compliance checks before we even get there, understand their practice, where they need to leverage certain ideas, where they need to make improvements, but we're also giving them concepts of, you know, from supervision and compliance, you know, how you can grow your business. But also, if you continue doing it the way you're doing it, you're also going to keep in that compliant manner as well, right? Because that's what everybody's concern is, right? How do I grow my business? But all the compliance stuff is always so difficult. Well, stay on this track, right? So that one, Ed, that one got me. That one might not make me sleep tonight. That was probably on you. So
We got it. We got him, team. You know, so much of this, what I'm hearing from today and giving your insights, are really outlined in what the regulators have already published, and the oversight report by FINRA is a phenomenal summary of the how, right? So there's, you know, update your policies and procedures, do account type analysis, rollovers. It's just this consistent theme that's being outlined, and maybe we could start there. And there's a lot of text here. We'll share this with everybody after. Let's perhaps zoom into the implementation part. And Jennifer, we hear a lot about the importance of documentation. I mean, FINRA's oversight report has at least 10, 15 points on that very subject.
Yeah.
Where is it that the firms are struggling, and how can they improve?
Yeah, so I think, you know, we've touched on some of these points already, but they're worth re-emphasizing, right? Which is you can complete forms all day long. You can even have the best tech systems, frankly, right? But being able to pull that data out, being able to recall it, being able to reproduce it, whether it's for an exam or internal or external, right? I think is always a challenge for firms, right? So making sure you understand where your data is housed, whether, again, that's a physical form or that's in some database or slick application that's out there, right? And then making sure that you have the ability to produce what the regulators are asking you for. Again, you know, Ed pointed this out, you know, a lot of firms have a lot of information, you know, 12-page forms, you know, we can spit, you know, double Z columns out in this Excel spreadsheet, but you're going to turn that over to the regulators, and the regulators are going to say, you know, what is this? And so I think that that's another place too, is just producing what they've asked for and then being able to articulate what you've produced actually is responding to the regulatory request. So making sure you can produce it, right, where you're getting it from, how you're going to pull it, and then what it looks like when it comes out so you can explain it are definitely challenges we see across our client base during regulatory exams.
100%. In a way, when you digitize the process, and I know I mean, it's not slightly, I am biased given that I work for a software company, but if you digitize those practices, right, there is this revolving or continuous improvement process that allows firms to not only continue to improve their, I'll call it upfront, account type, product type, cost comparison, all those pieces, improve that off the top, and then you can, to your point, Jennifer, analyze the data after the fact, periodically, whether you're doing internal annual reviews or whatnot, to say, hey, what's the quality of the products that Parham's recommending, and how does that compare against, the field? And alternatively, are there any patterns in my business around the account types that are being recommended, rollovers that are being recommended, what's being analyzed, and truly, am I acting in the investor's best interest? Again, if you have that best interest lens at heart. Let me shift to one of the key questions we often get, and it's around the topic of account type recommendations, including rollovers, and obviously reasonably available alternatives are sprayed all over this oversight report. How are you coaching your clients through these requirements?
Well, it's a really good question. You mentioned coaching. I think the first thing that I would coach clients to do is to use that oversight report as a means to assess all your programs, identify there's an area in the oversight report and it's applicable to your firm. It really is incumbent on you to take a look and see what controls you have in that place, because that's where FINRA is going to be looking. And so you want to make sure that you have those areas taken care of. And you're right. One of the areas that they identified was account type recommendations. And I tell our clients to focus on the staff bulletin that the SEC put out on account type recommendations. I think it was issued in early 2022. And when you read through it, one of the things they say in that, and I think they do in a lot of the bulletins that they've done recently on Reg BI, is that the expectations for advisors and broker-dealers aren't that significant. The reg best interest and the fiduciary requirements are very similar. So that's one thing that I would point out. But again, the main thrust, just like when making a recommendation of a particular product or service, is that you have to assess first the different types of accounts that are available to the client and make sure that the account that you recommend, account type that you recommend, is in the client's best interest. And so how do you do that? You need to understand the different characteristics first of the investor. What are their characteristics? What are their investment objectives, risk tolerance, financial profile, what are their needs? And then also look at the account characteristics and primarily things like features and costs. And one of the things that the SEC said in the staff bulletin is that, costs aren't always a factor, but costs aren't the only consideration. That's important, but they're always a consideration. And so, it's important to make sure you have that information. And going back to the question about documentation, that's one of the things that I think is confusing for firms, is because when they adopted Reg BI, they said that, you do not have to document the rationale or the basis for every recommendation that you make, including account type recommendation, but you have to document certain ones, right? And they gave some high-level examples, but it didn't provide a lot of guidance in terms of when you document and when you don't. And then that became even less clear when these staff bulletins came out, like the one on account type recommendations, where they said, yeah, you don't have to always do it, but in order to demonstrate that you're complying, to be able to demonstrate that you have a supervisory system in place, we would expect to see documentation in most cases. So then the question comes down to, when do you have documentation? And I think that one of the challenges for firms is that they really need to make sure that if they're not going to document the basis for the recommendations in every case, they really need to make sure that they're very clearly training and communicating through their policies and procedures and their training programs what needs to be documented and how it needs to be documented. And again, that's where you go back to technology. In these cases, the technology is such that using the technology, you're able to document stuff so much more efficiently, where you're almost documenting recommendations in every case because the technology is doing that for you. So the technology takes that really out of your hands. Another thing that I would mention, Param, you had mentioned rollovers, and that's one of the things we get a lot of questions about too, especially in light of the uncertainty around DOL's PTE 2020-02. The courts have stated that, and so the DOL's expectations in certain portions, especially around rollover recommendations, are on hold. But the SEC was clear that under Reg BI and under the fiduciary standard, as an account type recommendation, they expect you to review rollovers. And the process that they expect in reviewing rollovers is very similar to what's required under the DOL PTE. I think the major exception is that you don't have to provide the results of that to the client, but you still have to do that analysis. So that involves getting information from the employer plan when making a recommendation of a rollover to an IRA, assessing the costs and other features and benefits. And in that bulletin, the types of features and benefits that you need to consider are laid out, at least many of those. And so I would really take a look at that bulletin, look at the expectations that the commission lays out there, look at your processes and make sure that your processes around account type recommendations align to those expectations in the bulletin. Because I think that will prepare you for when an exam happens, if FINRA comes out and looks at it, against the things that they've identified in that regulatory oversight report.
Thank you, Ed. I think there's been a lot of insight throughout today's conversation. I mean, we're at 2:52, so we've got 8 minutes. So I'll invite folks to ask any questions for our wonderful panelists here today. I see a few coming in already, so maybe I can kind of start from there. Bryce, there's a question on what you're seeing, what's common practice, of course, for firms who have adopted technology. What is a common practice in ensuring A, there's adoption, B, there is value created for those advisors at those firms when it comes specifically to this area of, I'll call it, regulatory compliance responsibilities for the firms?
Yeah. So that's, enabling a great change management program includes creative ways to lead with a carrot and a stick at times, right? So having company policies of defining out this is what we do every time, every single time, and managing the workforce towards that. So, there's ways to pull reports from a digital offering such as InvestorCom to understand, like, how is adoption happening? What accounts have been set up that haven't gone through rollover analysis? And it doesn't happen overnight. Like, you don't go from 0% adoption to 100% overnight. There is a dance you take in leading your team to doing it consistently. So that, you have to work a program over time to get there. I think, George, you can talk about what you've seen and how adoption, it wasn't straight up overnight. And there was a process to get to that point. So as a practitioner within a firm, what has your experience been there?
Yeah, it's not easy. That's a whole conversation as well. It's definitely, again, it's like everything, and I think it's just repetition, it's understanding. But there's the learning curves, right? It comes with everything. I think I said it earlier in this call, right? Like, change is difficult for a lot of people, but to be successful, the ability to be flexible and adapt is really what's going to kind of keep you ahead of the game. So
Yeah.
I think it was it's still right. There's still those that we have to continue to address and remind them about the shifts. So it's
one thing
it's
I'll
all
add.
about-
I'm going to
Go ahead.
add, George. You probably experienced this too. That, like I said, it doesn't happen overnight. So a strategy to train a trainer first, right? Like, get early adopters that understand the why. You bring them into the fold. They do it. You need to ultimately expand your influence one person at a time throughout the firm. So your early adopters have done it, and now they're deputized to go out and spread the good news of how this technology is helping them, and align that within your whole change management like objective of by month 8 we're going to be at 100% adoption, and here's the steps that we take to get there.
Yeah, it's all good points. I think we've talked about it behind the scenes about how technology in 1 year went from, in the 30% range to the 99% range in some of the systems that we've been using. So it was kudos to that. And you're right. And one of the things that's been successful on my side, at least, was exactly what you said, Bryce. So I feel like sometimes we might be at the same place, but we do a lot of the training, right? But we handpick the trainers that we're going to help train everybody else, right? So again, but it's not about the fact that those people will help push that information technology down. It's about influence, right? So we share it with them, they share it with the advisors, and then we reach out to the advisors, right? So again, it's all about how you can produce that technology in a way where you're showing the benefit, right? So here's your trainers saying, I was trained by these people about how this works. Look at how we do this together. They adopt the technology, and then here we are enforcing that same technology. So it kind of just puts everything all together.
I love this conversation, and I almost knew that once we warm up, I basically don't have to ask any questions, and the conversation will kick off. So thank you to our panelists. Jennifer, there's a quick question around the SEC document that outlined the 15 specific investor information points. Do you have that top of mind? If not, we can follow up with the individual after.
Yeah, so it's a staff bulletin entitled The Standards of Conduct for Broker-Dealers and Investment Advisors. I have the link. I can post it in the chat real fast.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and
Jennifer?
I could put that staff bulletin in too, around account types, and there's also one on the care obligation, and that to kind of hit on all of those, because the SEC's provided a lot of great guidance in those spaces.
Absolutely. It's phenomenal. There's a lot of good information out there, and I think even this topic of conversation today, I think will help firms, move a little bit closer to figuring out the how part, because, 50% of our audience today indicated they're still using manual PDF forms and Excel spreadsheets. So plenty of opportunity for folks to engage in the process. Folks, we've got a couple of, once you close today's session, you're going to get a pop-up where you can subscribe to some of these, I'll call it case studies and handbooks that may be of value to you. With that said, let me say a quick thank you to our panelists today. Click for once PowerPoint works on time. Mr. Bryce Carter, George, Ed, and Jennifer, thank you very, very much for spending an hour of your afternoon with us here today, and we'll be back with another topic shortly.